Welcome, I am Liz Moseley. I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise. This is our regular weekly open news meeting. I can see lots of familiar names in the participants list. If you haven't been to one of these before, this is where we just take the opportunity to chew over a live news item, I guess, a story or stories that we're interested in, figure out what we think about how we might report on it, if there's anything useful we can add, or if it's been sort of adequately covered by everybody else. And today, I guess the big news in town, certainly for England, is the announcement made by Boris Johnson last night about how we're going to wheedle our way out of lockdown, and the sort of 4-step plan and all of that. And we're just going to sort of take a bit of time to absorb it together, to share how we feel about it and what we think, what's missing, what's unknown or unknowable at this point in time, what we think might happen next. And if we've got some time, we might have a little think about Donald Trump and the Supreme Court decision not to block him from releasing all of his various papers, and whether that will end up seeing him go to prison. So we might have time to do a bit of Trump at the end. But my colleague James Wilson is marshalling the chat today. Hello, James. So if you would like to make a point, I very much hope you do weigh in the chat. And I will bring in your points of view as we go along. I'm going to start with a sort of open-ended question, really. We used to quite often do this at the beginning of Think-Ins, where we'd ask a sort of polling type question, but I'd love to know, yesterday evening, when I didn't listen to the announcement, actually, I read it, sort of looked through the sort of summary document that was sent to me by the CBI. We do regular webinars with the CBI for Tortoise, and I was prepping for one I did this morning, getting my head around what the government said in terms of the sort of key milestone dates and what would need to happen if, and then what would be permitted in terms of opening up and what have you. And I felt a lot better, because I think maybe I'm ever a pessimist, and I had locked July in my mind for the earliest time I was going to be allowed to do anything and see anybody. And in the event, it felt better to me. It felt better to me that I had a sense of, I know it's not certainty, but I had a sense of a pattern, had a sense of steps, and some way of sort of reaching for Easter as something to look forward to. And I'm just interested to hear if everybody else felt better too, because on the webinar that I did this morning with members of the CBI, there was a mixed bag of people feeling, some people a lot better and some people not feeling so much better for lots of reasons. And then, in fact, in the first lockdown, we talked a lot about people feeling quite anxious about sort of emerging from their sort of bubbles, both their social distancing bubbles and their sort of household reality bubbles. So I'm interested to know how you feel. I'm interested to know what isn't clear still and what you think is missing in terms of the detail. I mean, there's a sort of 68 pages or something of the statement. It's a lot more comprehensive than it was, or than some of the announcements have been in the past. But there's still sort of devil is in the detail, and it's not entirely clear for some types of businesses, whether they are 12th of April businesses or whether they're May businesses and those sorts of things. So I'd love to know what you're not clear on as well. And we'll just sort of chew the fat really about it. I'm going to start with Phoebe, because I think sometimes people's responses to these kind of things might be determined a lot determined by your life setup. Hi, Phoebes.
Hi.
You've put your rainbow top on because the sun is shining, so it's feeling very spring-like. How did you feel about it all?
I struggle to feel optimistic because I just think I felt optimistic before, and all I can think about is Christmas and that bit in November where we were like, we'll do 1 month, it'll be fine. Christmas is going to work. I'm going to see my family for 5 days. And then, like, as this happened before, new variant comes along and we sat there. And I remember sitting and watching the press conference with my boyfriend and just being like, this is got, Christmas is gone. It's stressful. Do we go home? And that, you know, that up and down. And I think I've heard a few people say out as well on Twitter that, you know, I prefer to stay in lockdown for longer if the moment we come out of it, we're actually coming out of it, rather than, you know, coming out and then going back in again, and what we hit September and then there's another variant and then there's another problem. And I guess that comes down to the vaccine as well, and everything around that. And you know, we're not vaccinated. It's less people have had the first dose, and I think that language needs to be really, really careful with that, because you know it's 3 months before you get your second dose. So the chances of me being vaccinated as a young person with no existing health conditions mean that's probably not going to be until the end of summer. And then, you know, I'm thinking about that and the fact that I could spread the virus, and you know, it's too many things to be like happy 21st of June, can't wait.
So when you think about the markers, and let's assume that let's hope / assume that we hit them, because obviously it's no earlier than, and we can't sort of take these dates as definitely going to happen, and we'll find out the week before if they are. But let's say it all happens as laid out on the 29th of March, and then the 12th of April, and then the 17th of May, and then the 21st of June. Let's say that's the schedule. Is it your feeling, because of that sort of conflict, that you aren't expecting to be vaccinated until sort of back of the queue, and it could be deep into July before you get your first shot? Is it your plan to sort of take full advantage of all the things you're allowed to do, or are you going to be more hesitant than that?
I think I'm it's hard. I live in London, so like there's, you know, you can say all you want that, you know, 2 people can go outside and have a cup of coffee, but if you go to Hampstead Heath on a weekend, you couldn't really tell that, because there's huge groups of people. So, you know, things like that is a bit harder. But I mean, just for me, like I don't have anyone close to me who's at risk, but I just do feel a bit anxious of, you know, the eat out to help out of last summer. We know I did use it. I did go out and have pizza, and all the restaurants were slammed. And I sit there and I think about it and I go, should I have done that? Should I have done that? And I think it was kind of brought up really well by Nicky Wolf in that piece, you know, when we went to the pub the night before. Like I just, those thoughts like do sit there, but that doesn't mean I don't want to go get my hair cut and go for a pint in a beer garden, because I quite like to do that. I do struggle with that, like that little niggle at the back of my head is like, oh, should you be doing this? Or should we just let everyone over 80 go out and have an absolute ball on June 21st and we all stay home?
Thanks, Phoebes. The chat is great and lively, so I'm going to come straight to some people who've been making comments in the chat. Emma Harley, who's another Tortoise colleague, you've got a lot of love for your comments in the chat. Just talk us through how are you feeling, Emma? You're in the office, Emma.
Yeah, I'm in the office today. It's my office day to do all the stuff here. I think I actually felt positive. I think not, because I think it's that whole thing, as human beings, the unknown is a scary thing. And if you've got nowhere to like hang your hat at all, or nothing to, you know, put a marker on, that's quite a discomforting place to be. So even though, yes, these can move, and even though maybe they're a bit optimistic, maybe they're a bit pessimistic, for me personally, I was like, okay, so I've got some markers in the sand now. So I'm like, yeah, you know, maybe I'll be able to join the gym in April. You know, I've provisionally booked a chance to get my hair cut, and it might not happen. You know, I'm a realist. So I'm not like, if it doesn't happen, I'm not going to be devastated, but it still just feels like there's a way that you can start to plan, and you can start to sort of see an end to it. So actually I felt quite positive about that. But I think for me, I really love being outdoors. And I do live on my own, and I'm just not clear when you look at everything. I mean, international travel, there's a very big marker on that, but I'm not clear about when can I, you know, go in my car and drive down, for example, like I said, to the South Downs and just go for a walk on my own, which I would do before, you know, on a weekend, I'd go for a long hike, or, you know, even travel further than that kind of 2 miles of Greenwich that I live in. And I'm not sure that was particularly clear. It's like you can meet someone outside, not for exercise, but how far, does that still just mean Greenwich Park for me? Or does that mean?
I think this is the thing. I think the stay local changes on April the 12th. I think after April the 12th, you can go, you know,
wherever you want
within England, as far at the moment, as far as we know. I think. But how local is local has always been hard to define.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I put at the end, which was really interesting, I thought this weekend was, and I think it was a psychology thing. You could see, my friend and I were talking about it, like people are voting with their feet now. So I live in Greenwich, and at the top of every parking space is taken in the park, because we'd gone out for a walk around the Heath. The queues were down both sides of the park for cars trying to get into park. And I'm like, where are these people coming from suddenly? And like the Heath was covered, and it was like, it's almost like the sun was out. I get it. Like the last couple of weekends, it's been -10 and everyone's like kind of, but it was almost like this. They knew an announcement was coming. They were hopeful it was supposed to be this roadmap out. So everyone was almost jumping the gun slightly, sort of, I think psychology wise, going, oh, well, it must be a bit safer now. So actually I'll test the water. And it was crazy. It was like a normal summer day.
Yeah.
So that was quite interesting. And I think, like my friend said, people are voting with their feet in some ways, that they've had enough. And I think if you took a snapshot of the park, that was the sentiment of the country at the moment, which is this sense of needing to escape and this feeling of, you know, kind of wanting to be outdoors and doing things. And I thought it was quite interesting. So it will be, I think it's going to be a challenge for people not to kind of jump off and start doing things they're not supposed to ahead of that game, particularly like you say, if it's not very clear about what you can and can't do.
Yeah. Thanks, Emma. And there's a lot of people sort of echoing what you're saying about, in your case, Greenwich Park, Hampstead Heath, Borough Market, where I know Mark lives very close to Borough Market. I went for a walk down on the South Bank. I think it might even have been just before Christmas, I can't remember. And Borough Market is heaving because, of course, it's outside takeaway. You know, it's been open and it's incredible. It sort of feels like Mark says, it feels like a festival. So I agree with you. I definitely think there's a sort of sense of it's coming. So maybe I'll just go, kind of that vibe. And the sun, you know, encourages that sort of feeling as well. I'm going to go to Ellen, and then I'm going to come, if I can, to James, because I think there's sort of some underneath, there's the sort of feelings we have about what will we be allowed to do. And then there's this sort of bigger picture stuff, which is to do with what does this mean for the long term, you know, living with this thing forever. Ellen, your folks are in Scotland, right?
Yeah, that's right. They're up in Edinburgh.
And are you down south somewhere?
Yeah, and I'm in London, so near Hampstead Heath. So I've seen the same gatherings of people that Phoebe has as well.
So is Nicola Sturgeon making an announcement today or no?
Yeah, she is. She'll be setting that out, and maybe there'll be something there about what happens with the borders within the UK, because it's been quite a while now that it's actually been illegal to cross the border without an essential reason, which is tricky. And you know, my parents are of an age where my dad's had his first vaccine. My mom hasn't been called yet, but is expecting it in the next couple of weeks. So they're kind of getting there, and that feels a lot better. But when you live far enough away from the people that you care about, which I'm sure lots of people on this call do, if it's like further than a day's travel, then what do you do, and when is that going to be allowed? Yeah.
Well, we'll hear what time's Nicola Sturgeon making her announcement.
I'm not sure. I mean, she does a daily briefing every afternoon, so I imagine it will be part of that.
Okay, fingers crossed for you, Ellen, and your folks. Obviously, I feel the same. I love my brother. My brother lives in Yorkshire, where I'm from, and I haven't seen him for over a year. And when I read the scouring, that was particularly, you know, April the 13th. I'm in the car. I'm going to see him. James, I know you've got some anxieties, particularly about this sort of feeling underneath that underpinned the thinking with this. You know, the implication, the clear implication from the government is, we're going to have to accept that there will be people moving freely who aren't vaccinated, who can spread, but essentially, so long as it's not going to kill you, we're okay with that. That's sort of the message, right?
So I think I'm always a little nervous, Liz. And by the way, I'd be interested to know what the CBI people said, what their kind of what your read on it was, what was good and what was to worry about. But when I was watching Boris Johnson, there's always that moment when, you know, you see someone saying, look, I recognise that the general public will realise there's a choice between going slower and going faster. And I was sitting there thinking, is that really the choice? Is that really the big choice? And I think they've made three choices, or they're in the process of making three choices. The first is they made a choice to move away from regional tiering, right? And they've moved to a national unwinding. And that seems to me quite interesting. Personally, I'm in favour of it, but it's interesting that they didn't really explain why we were in a regional lockdown for such a long period of time, and that's just evaporated. The second is he's obviously waiting for Rishi Sunak to make the decisions on support. They're making it look like the financial support decisions are sort of automatic and inevitably linked to the timing of release, you know, to in effect to that June 21st date. But actually, the real choice around the economy is, do you do big US style stimulus? Do you take on a lot more debt because you want to refire up the economy, or do you do something more EU style, i.e. smaller? And he didn't really talk about that, but that's arguably the biggest choice, particularly for young people and employment. That's a really big one. But the biggest choice of all, Robert Peston asked Chris Whitty about this, but they didn't really get into it, which is they've moved from the infection being the trigger to hospitalization being the trigger. They've effectively said, we're willing to accept a level of infection. And the way they frame it is, we're going to have to live with this like flu, right? But everything we've seen is that COVID is nothing like flu. Look at the inflammation, look at the multi-organ issues, look at, long COVID. And what I feel as though we haven't really begun to think about is, all right, well, if we have a high infection rate, and if infections are going to move also, amongst younger people, what are those, not school-age children, not even necessarily university-age children, but younger people, 30s and 40s, what are the implications for that? And particularly given that everyone's, I think, underestimating the level of catch-up within the NHS. People I speak to within the NHS say, it's going to take a matter of years to catch up with what we've, had to put on hold. And so I don't feel as though that part of it, which is we've moved from infection to hospitalization, has fully been kind of digested. And that's the thing I'm interested to learn more about.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And certainly the sort of backlog, it sounds a horrible word to use, but I'm really very, very worried about the cancer referrals. Tens of thousands of people fewer who are now in the system than I think will be sort of almost one of the biggest sort of stories of the back 6 months of the year. Thank you, James. In terms of the CBI, I'll just sort of feedback because I think it's useful. Obviously, the people who join these webinars that we do with the CBI are people who run businesses. And for them, there was a lot of questioning about the testing, the workplace testing rules, and there was a lot of changes in the announcement yesterday in terms of who is eligible to have funded tests for the people in their place of work who aren't able to work from home, and that was extended to the end of June, but you have to apply by the end of March. There was a lot of questioning about the detail of the testing provision. And then for what the CBI were calling sort of plans for plans. So the things that really matter for business that haven't been catered for in the package of announcements that was really focused on sort of individuals' behaviour more than sort of business behaviour, which was the approach to sort of clarify COVID status certification and all the discussion about vaccine passports and how that's going to be managed, and not so much will it be mandated, but how will it be handled, and data privacy and all of that, a sort of sense of how the government's going to manage that. Secondly, and I didn't know this, and I don't know any of the detail of it, so if somebody does, I'd love to hear, this thing about pilot large-scale events run in April to sort of test how they can operate, because the events industry has obviously been completely sort of kiboshed to see impact on infection rates, impact on managing flows of people and all of that. Thirdly, obviously the global travel task force being reconvened with Grant Shapps, because there's nothing at the moment in the easing that talks about international travel, and obviously that's a huge thing for business in particular, and also for the rest of us. And lastly, and I think this is a huge one, the social distancing, what happens with that, the whole 1 meter plus rule, because if you hit step 4, whether it's the 21st of June or later than that, removing all legal limits on social contact, what does that really mean in terms of everybody piling in back at the office? I think that there's a sort of quite a lot that needs to be sort of thought through as regards to sort of guidelines for that. So,
They think that, and I don't know whether Matt knows the answer to that, because he wrote about that in his piece on sort of what irreversible means. I love the fact that you have to write a column and go, no, let me explain, irreversible doesn't necessarily mean
doesn't mean it can't go backwards.
Yeah, but how many, was there any worry about October, November, December, i.e. spring out in June, have a brilliant summer, and then it comes back in the autumn?
Does Matt want to weigh in, Matt Dancona?
No, I didn't know whether you. No, I'm just asking with you and the businesses from the CBI. Was there any worry?
It didn't come up. I think that honestly, I feel like everybody is so panicked about the end of March cliff edge on the current support packages, and we've still got 9 days to wait for the budget. To your point about what's going to happen with the bridge, that I think people have, and to Katie's point in the chat that she just made, if you're already on the edge of bankruptcy, the 21st of June is a long way away. So that was my sense of the sort of scope of where people were thinking. Let's bring Matt in. Are you there, Matt? I know you're hot-footing it from a call. Hopefully he's there. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm all right. How are you? You wrote a brilliant column yesterday.
Thank you.
Tell us what irreversible means.
Well, I thought it meant it can't be reversed, but you know,
you're old-fashioned like that, though,
I've
Matt.
been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again, because it turns out, doing a bit of digging, actually before the press conference, that it was really just a word meant to make people feel cheered up, because Boris is kind of the key starting point for the whole package was there can never be a lockdown for, you know, the public won't put up with it, the NHS can't stand it, and businesses will, you know, collapse en masse if we have a fourth national lockdown. So the word irreversible is in there to calm business a bit and also raise people's morale. However, as he made explicit at the press conference, it's not really irreversible. It's an aspiration, that terrible political word, which means in fact reversible, because what he said was he'd like it to be irreversible, which is true of many things in life, but he might have to reverse it. And I think the thing that's worth bearing in mind about the whole package that was unveiled last night is that in order to give it a kind of Borisy boosterish feel, and also something that the Red Tops would like this morning, there were a lot of dates in it, but actually, and quite sensibly, there were a lot of conditionalities in it. The 4 tests that are applied, in which I think vaccine effectiveness and the levels of hospitalization will be very important, but also they'll be keeping an eye separately on case rates. The big worry is that, and it was interesting to hear Whitty and Valence and Boris all say in terms explicitly, there are going to be more deaths, because there will be a surge as we come out of lockdown, to whatever extent, there always is. And the big question is to what extent, how high that surge will rise. So the kind of yes but at the end of every sentence was yes, but what if actually there starts to be another surge, however small, however localized. As James said, they've moved away from the tiered approach. There are a lot of ambiguities still in this, and it's great that there's a kind of, you know, to Emma's point earlier, it's great that there is now something that we can hang our hat on, but my worry is that it might be taken away and the hat fall down at any one point. It's not an ironclad calendrical roadmap. It's a series of phase conditional options, and I would be surprised if every single target date is made.
Matt, on the tests, the 4 tests, are there, and I'm sorry if I've just completely missed this, but are there sort of metrics against each of those tests? That it's very obvious what the gist of each of them is.
Yes.
So number 3, infection rates do not risk a surge in hospitalizations. That's not the same as saying if the R rate goes above, is it? No,
it's not. And it's really interesting to say that, because there was a debate in SAGE about whether R should remain at one of the tests, and it isn't. And there's ongoing debate in SAGE about what the metrics should be. So that's rather revealingly opaque still. You know, and to be fair, with good reason, because actually there are, you know, if they said as long as the case numbers stay below a certain level, say 10,000 or whatever, that wouldn't mean very much, because there are cases can be at varying degrees of lethality, and as we know, variants are now entering the picture, and so case numbers can be very dangerous, less dangerous, and so on. So I think the opaqueness is on one level very political and naughty, on another level probably sensible and designed to keep their options as widely open as they can.
Matt, before I let you go, can I ask two more questions? I want to pick up on what Katie is talking about in the chat, and you may not know, I don't know, which is, do we know whether if you've been vaccinated, you can still suffer with long COVID? Do we have?
The only answer I can give to that is based on the fact that variant-based illness is more of a problem in that respect, because the original version of the virus, the vaccines give you such a high level of protection that it would be very odd if your body suffered at all. But the variants, and especially the South African variant, which has not been a big problem so far in this country, but also the Kentish variant, you can get ill with it. You still won't probably be hospitalized or certainly not die unless you're very, very unlucky. But the vaccines offer a diminished protection, and therefore, to Katie's question, you could suffer some of the features of long COVID. Now, the data on this is very, very minimal at the moment, but the assumption would be that you'd be very unlucky if you'd been vaccinated to suffer from organ failure, but you might suffer from joint pain, chronic fatigue, that kind of thing. So I think long COVID is going to become more and more and more of a story and a problem. I think, to James's point, the idea that COVID will become like the flu just because some of the numbers involved will be similar in terms of hospitalizations, that was the weakest link in what was said last night.
Yeah. And then the other thing I wanted to pick up on, which a couple of people have mentioned from your piece, is this thing about making it mandatory. Not really that, but this thing about workplace.
Yeah.
If no jab, no job, and all of that. And the piece you wrote yesterday was, I think, very clear on what you think about that.
Well, I mean, look, it's against the law to, except in very limited diminished responsibility cases, to enforce medical treatment upon people. So there's zero prospect of what people call a vaccine passport, i.e. a kind of ID card you have to carry around, authorized and made mandatory by the state. That's not going to happen. You will have to show proof of vaccination to get into lots of countries, but that's already the case with yellow fever and just other things. So that's a kind of red herring. The really important point is what happens at the door of workplaces, cultural venues, pubs and restaurants. And it won't surprise you to know that the government has not made its mind up about this at all, because the law is very, it hasn't been tested before, obviously, because we haven't had a pandemic of this scale since 1918. And there are workplaces have a responsibility, a duty of care, but on the other hand, they are also obliged not to be discriminatory. So there's that. Then there's the Equality Act of 2010, which might protect those who have vaccine hesitancy as a protected category. And there are all sorts of horrors in this. I think what will actually might make practice defeat kind of long theoretical abstruse arguments is that if pubs and restaurants say, look, you can't come into this restaurant unless you've got proof of vaccination or you've just got a recent test. That will be a really good incentive for the last demographics to get the vaccine, and it will kind of sort itself out in a kind of granular way. I suspect that'll happen. I don't think the O2, for example, can reopen without some sort of vaccine certificate, because you can't have hundreds of men in black bomber jackets conducting lateral flow tests on, fans of Rihanna. It just doesn't work. So I suspect that that good practice will be the answer here, rather than lofty jurisprudential argument. But I'm not. I don't think people should live in fear of there being a kind of Stasi-like document you have to carry around with you. It's not going to happen. What they might find is that their local boozer won't let them in without a QR code showing they've had the vaccine, and then they'll just have to choose whether they want to go there or to another one.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Matt. There's some really interesting back and forth in the chat. I do want to come to Emily, and Emily and Luke have had an interesting conversation about the sort of liberties aspect of this. But before I do that, I can't help but notice, and this is a sort of unscientific bit of live research, that a number of the sort of younger crew of tortoises are agreeing with one another that over the last few weeks, they have friends who have followed lockdown rules to the letter for a year, who sort of over the last few weeks have started to bend the rules a little bit. And I can't help noticing that James, Nimmo, Marion, Tom, somebody said at the beginning, and then you've also said me too, me too, me too, in terms of people just getting to the stage. And maybe it's because, I don't know if Nimmo's there, your Instagram pops up a year ago, here's the photograph of you a year ago, and you just can't believe it. It seems like another life. Nimmo, are you there? Is this something you're aware of? I just wonder if that's true, and there's a sort of demographic of people, maybe it's on the younger end, who've kind of got to the last few weeks of February and just thought, you know what, sod it, I just can't anymore. I'm going to meet my mate for a walk, just to have a walking pub, kind of discussion. Then that's baked into the infection rate still to come. Is it something you've sort of noticed? What kind of time scale?
So I've noticed it in terms of like, not necessarily my close friends, but definitely going on Instagram and then seeing people's stories and watching people who have, I know, followed the rules and now all of a sudden having a few mates around, or just doing things that they haven't been doing before, or at least that I wasn't aware that they were doing. And it is this thing where for me, it feels like this is just life now. Like, I feel like there is no end, even though there's like yesterday, all these like, all this stuff has been introduced and it's like, well, all these markers are coming out now. It still feels like, as we said at the beginning, that this is a bit of a trick, and I don't feel like this is ever going to end. And it feels like life before this was this mythological memory that I have was a fever dream and it never really happened. And this is the only life that we've ever lived. And I think that people are hitting this point, and I've kind of erred on the side of despairingly following the rules and just like, it is what it is until it's not what it is. But I think a lot of people have decided that like, for my own well-being, for like myself, I can't continue this. And it's not that like anyone's been out raving or anything, but they have been little by little doing. And I think that with it starting now, it will probably get worse and worse in terms of just like it going from a handful of friends over to small parties and all that kind of stuff. But I think that people are just at the point of despair to where they can't actually. It's hitting a year now, and I think that year anniversary, like Ella said in the chat, is a bit too much for a lot of people, including myself.
Yeah, thanks, Nimmo. And I'm taking Katie's point. It's not just the young folk who are sort of getting to the stage where they're thinking, you know what, the most vulnerable have been vaccinated and the sun's out. Maybe I'll take a little risk in a way that I wouldn't have done when it was -8 outside, apart from anything else. And just props to Luke. I'll probably come to you, Luke, after I've spoken to Emily Ben in a sec, but I'm really enjoying the use of the word undergirding. The weather is the undergirding factor in a lot of this. I've never heard that word before, but I have a sense of what it means. Emily,
hi Liz.
Hiya. You and Luke, I've got a fly in my face. You and Luke have been having a really interesting conversation, and James Wilson's point about how this question of concern about liberties has sort of been absorbed by the Steve Bakers of the world, and the kind of don't wear a mask, it's a face nappy and all of that, and actually there's a much more serious set of considerations relating to this.
So part of the reason I want to talk about it is because I don't think this should be left to just one wing of the Conservative Party to care about civil liberties, because I think that gets you in quite a worrying situation. And underlying all of this is you can agree with strict measures, but have a very fundamental concern about how they've been put in place. Because when we saw Boris Johnson yesterday, it was quite interesting. He announced these measures to Parliament when for the last year, Parliament has had basically no input into any of the measures, both putting them in or restrictions of lockdown, because the government's relied so much on secondary delegated legislation and statutory instruments. I find it quite concerning that so many of our civil liberties have been taken away without any concern whatsoever and no accountability or real scrutiny. And it doesn't make good policy because the government's never under any pressure on various aspects of it. I mean, for a year now, people have been talking about lack of financial support for isolation, which is a massive failure as part of test, trace and isolate, partly because so many people can't afford to. That's kind of issue where if you have to go through a proper parliamentary process, you have an opportunity to try and add it somewhere in a bill. But if you don't have that opportunity, you're never going to be able to. And I'm not trying to. I find it quite difficult because when you're thinking about this, it's these are all political decisions. I mean, they're informed by scientific evidence, obviously, but it's not just scientific evidence full stop. These are political decisions. And once you take away the politics and policy from it, you can see all sorts of things disappear liberty-wise that actually is quite concerning. And, hopefully this is the last round of restriction easings, and in a few months we have some of it back. But I do think we need to step back and think about how we've allowed them to disappear without any concern. And I find it difficult that some voices on the left of which I probably would consider myself part of that political tradition, spent 3 years fighting for parliamentary power in Brexit debates, like fighting for them, 600 hours worth of torturous. I saw some of them, and they were pretty torturous. And yet this time, they spent 600 hours debating Brexit. The first Coronavirus Act went through without pretty much any debate and no vote. It concerns me because it's fine for this. It could be slightly more nefarious an issue next time that we wouldn't all consider was as important. And yet you've set the precedent.
Why do you think that is?
People were incredibly scared, especially at the beginning. I understand why. I mean, my mother was rushed to hospital the second day of lockdown with coronavirus. So I can understand why. I mean, in that situation, I wouldn't want anyone to leave their house on pain of anything if I thought I get it. Fear, unknown, national emergency, the main opposition, right? The Labour Party has taken the approach throughout that the government hasn't done enough. So there hasn't been a natural political or force anywhere arguing for kind of at least more scrutiny or worrying about the freedom side until the COVID recovery group came along, which took months anyway. It's kind of started with perhaps David Davis did a little bit of it earlier, but there hasn't been a kind of political tradition of doing so, and people is a mixture of that politics, lack of political opposition, and fear and unknown, and thinking that this is serious enough. There's an underlying thing where this is serious enough that restrictions have to be curtailed. I'm not arguing that restrictions didn't have to be curtailed. I'm arguing about the way that it's been done and the fact that we don't seem to care about. It's just on one level, it's very different to our normal tradition of civil liberties here. And if you care about civil liberties normally, you should care about them also in an emergency. The fact it's an emergency is not in and of itself a good enough excuse to not care about them.
Yeah, understood. Thanks very much, Emily. I'm going to go to T Saha now. I wonder if you're Tanishq. I can't tell. Sometimes I can see your whole name, but I don't know if you're the same person. T Saha, are you there?
Hi.
Hiya.
Yeah. That's...
Oh, it is you. Hello. I wasn't sure if it was. Sometimes it says your whole name. What do you think about this? You're comparing the situation in India. The sort of lockdown happened, and it's never mind about getting food. What do you think about all this?
I just think it would be like I echo Emily's point, and then it would just be good to have a bit more discussion. I understand that it is a pandemic, and people need to consider that they're going to be causing everyone illness and sickness, but it would just give reassurance to the people to understand that this is a matter that's been deliberated on, and there's some sort of agreement as to this makes sense. It would just be nice to have this discussed in Parliament and also give people time to react to it. I was speaking about the India case because we had the announcement of lockdown at like 8 p.m. on the 23rd, which said that on the stroke of midnight on the 24th, lockdown is going to happen. And as it panned out, it led to people losing lives from reasons apart from COVID. Like they couldn't, like daily wage laborers couldn't find food, couldn't find shelter. They had to make it home, but they tried to go on foot, and then they were hit by freight trains or something like that. So it was just
horrendous.
I don't think it was like well thought out of, and I think that is an element that can come if you have parliamentary discussion and debate, which also invites some sort of like filling in the gaps. It doesn't need to be disagreement with the idea that lockdown is going to be implemented. It can just be suggestions on how this lockdown plan can be improved for the people.
Yeah, thanks so much. Nice to see you. I'm going to go to Andrew Girdwood now. I'm not going to go to Michael Kowalski to discuss whether or not he would consider walking down the street naked and if that is an infringement of liberties. But Andrew, you just don't get the concern in a way about the civil liberties argument, because what we're talking about is people dying if you don't shut down.
Yes, I don't think it is a civil liberties argument. It is not your liberty to make people ill. It's not. And so it only became compulsory when people didn't realise or didn't believe that's what they were doing. And that's exactly when the government needs to step in and make it happen.
I suppose, so I think everybody's in agreement with that point. I suppose what Emily's trying to say is that in an extraordinary situation where it's urgent, and as you say, people's lives are at risk and you have to move quickly, has this set a precedent for other arguably less urgent, less life-threatening scenarios for the government to behave in a way that is not representative, if you like, in terms of representative democracy? Do you think it has set a precedent or no?
I think the precedent was already there. So if I invent a new type of combustible, a new type of explosive firework, it's still illegal for me to go, do you know what? I fancy setting this off in the pub. Without a question, people understand that was a dangerous thing to do. I wasn't allowed to do it. That's it's just like COVID's invisible. That's the only thing that makes us different.
I suppose what the question would be that so many people's lives are at risk with lots of government policies, but perhaps not as directly as with COVID. So I take your point about COVID's invisible as opposed to the combustible that you've just invented. But there are lots of policies that threaten people's lives and livelihoods in the same way.
Yes, and there is already laws about making people sick. So I don't think anything new was invented. It just became, look, this is real. You're not doing what you're required, so we're going to spell it out to you. I don't see what's new. I mean, the situation is new, but the legal precedent I don't think is new at all.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go to, thanks, Andrew. Nice to see you as always. I'm going to go to Luke. Are you there, Luke? Thank you for using the word undergirding. That's going to be my word of the day. Very strong. So you feel strongly about this. You've been talking to Emily about it. Where are you on this whole liberties precedent thing?
Well, yeah, I'm trying to get my head around it still, because I think I agree wholeheartedly with Emily on a lot of the points that she raised about a sort of slippage in the standards that we have around asking our politics and the creation of laws to work in a particular way, or even demanding that it does. And what I was trying to get to was, what are the actual mechanisms by which that ought to have been happening, as far as Emily sees it, and anybody else? And are those mechanisms not working? And do we need others? That would be something I'd love to hear ideas about. And then just to Andrew's point, I think there's one way of phrasing the resistance of the actions that people take during the lockdown, which is to say it's making people ill. If I take a bus journey, or if I had been out for a walk or running in a park and I was too close to somebody, you can choose to phrase it as if I was agentively sort of making somebody ill, or you can look at it as part of the trade-off that goes alongside me having some freedoms, and then there also being risks, and we try and use governance to manage those freedoms and those risks alongside one another. And I'm not sure it's a completely fair way of painting it, but like I say, I'm still not 100% decided.
Thanks, Luke. Emily, what do you think? This feels like a big one. I mean, I can see you're still live in the chat. Just do you want to come back on any of those?
Yeah, things? Well, I just that there are that, you know, our entire democratic process and scrutiny accountability should be used to take away freedom. So that's the kind of underlying thing. I'm not saying that freedom should never be taken away, clearly, but to Luke's point, there are trade-offs in policy. That's why we have a political process. I mean, so many other areas of policy, you could say the consequences of which lives would be curtailed early. I mean, there's hence the whole debate about impacts of austerity and lives being shortened over the last 10 years, that this is a consequence of political decisions. So, you know, part of my problem is that if you look at some of the guidance versus the law problem, which has led to lots of police who have fined COVID police, COVID fines, a lot of them have had to be rescinded. In some police forces, over half of the fines have had to be rescinded because they were based on a complete misunderstanding of what was the law versus what was guidance. And this comes down to the fact that in some cases, laws versus guidance have been released at kind of 3 a.m. with no proper scrutiny or accountability. It hasn't gone through any of the normal parliamentary process, which allows these confusions to come in, and people don't really know what's right and what they can and they can't do. I don't want to live in a situation where, because the process hasn't been followed as it should have, as it arguably, my point, it should have been, you leave to these confusions and people are not sure of their rights. It is not enough in an emergency to say that it's an emergency, therefore we can get rid of all this stuff. Partly because in the next emergency, which could be more nefarious, and if you study history, it's always an emergency that starts a complete restriction of your democratic rights, and you don't know where it ends. I'm not a doom mongerer. But I think there are enough precedents in the recent past around other countries that you would say have a democratic process, but the minute you stop following that process, things can start to go wrong. And it's not fair to say, but people throw back at me, well, you know, people will die if you don't do this. Every political policy decision, there is that risk. We shouldn't treat this anything other. And in fact, the more that we have proper discussion of data and what we think and what kind of trade-offs we're willing to take, the better, because then you're involving more people in the kind of decisions that people have to take.
And Emily, before you go, I'd love to understand, because I think this is really fascinating, and in particular that point that I think it was James Wilson made a while ago, which is this conversation, which is difficult and nuanced, you know, but it's a really fundamental, important point about democracy. You know, I sort of point to the enormous kerfuffle about the proroguing when that all happened.
Yeah, I mean, my gosh, yeah, quite.
Right?
I mean, that was.
So, but I think it's fair to say that it's not a conversation that has been had very much in, as you say, on the left, if you like. It's sort of it has been absorbed by a sort of slightly reactionary, fairly unpleasant rah taking away our British liberties, kind of which deadens the whole thing and it makes it easy to ignore it.
That's not my political tradition.
I
worry about, and part of the reason I want people to start talking about it, so it's not just left to those people. But
my question is why hasn't it emerged from the left?
So I think partly because part of it's kind of politics, where if you think about the beginning of this process, the opposition to the government that it wasn't going far enough. So if you're the opposition, the Labour Party, also, I mean, it had a change of leader right at the beginning of it, right? The 4th of April last year. But if that's your starting point in this, and in our opposition, it's basically the Labour Party, the SNP, that's a whole different conversation. If that's your starting point, the government hasn't gone far enough, it's not quick enough, it needs to do more, you're kind of stuck on that political track. So that's always been the argument. You did eat out to help out, you shouldn't have done it. You haven't locked down quick enough, you should have done it earlier. It's hard to maintain that political opposition with at the same time arguing more for far more
immediate
scrutiny, because they're actually not mutually incompatible, because you can I could have said everything I've just said in the last 5 minutes, and at the same time said you should do, you should have done more,
lock down quicker, support,
because one is a kind of process procedural issue and one is more a political issue. As it happens, I found myself weirdly becoming a much more civil libertarian, and actually am willing to countenance negative consequences on one level for the freedoms to be maintained. But these are hard political trade-offs, and I found it annoying that partly because the main opposition has been, you haven't done it enough, Nicola Sturgeon likewise, you haven't done quick enough, you haven't been able to have any of this debate, and then you're left with the kind of only element of it being the rebellious, for want of a better phrase, COVID recovery group. But I think it goes back to the start. I think also the problem is a lot of politicians abdicated political responsibility just to scientists, and that gets you in trouble, because scientific evidence alone, if you took it on loads of other policies, would curtail loads of freedoms and you wouldn't discuss it. But we don't treat other issues just by abdicating political responsibility just to scientific evidence. So I think the combination of those two things at the beginning left you in this position, and it's then tricky. But I go back to my final worry in this whole thing is not enough people are talking about this, because you can't leave it to one bit of one political tradition.
I think thanks very much, Emily. I think it's really fascinating, actually. I didn't expect to be talking about this in this thinking today, but that's possibly the sign of a good conversation. So James Wilson is making the point, I don't think there's much public interest in the parliamentary process. And I might just go to Louise Jarvis, who sort of suggests maybe why that might be. Are you there, Louise?
Hi.
Hiya. You just
it was a genuine question. The whole parliamentary process. I mean, we've been through 2, 3, 4 years, however much of parliamentary process around Brexit, and I'm fed up to the back teeth of it. And it's like, what's the point of it on some level? So was that some lethargy as a leftover from that debacle, basically? In, as James says, I don't think many of the public are that interested in parliamentary process, because what we've witnessed of parliamentary process in recent years is not really great. And you watch PMQs and all that stuff, and it's just like, this is parliamentary process. This is just a charade. And it's not. It's the stuff that happens behind the scenes, not necessarily in that chamber where the stuff really happens, which is where this should have been discussed and debated and really gone into. But I think in terms of the public, the public facing bit of Parliament, people are just, it's become a farce almost, I feel.
Yeah, I can certainly see there's some legitimacy for that perspective, Louise, when you especially you look at, like you say, there was the Brexit thing, there was the proroguing, there seemed to be sort of one after the other, and people would be forgiven arguably for not just saying, well, it's boring, but also saying, well, they'll do what they want anyway. And it's hard to keep on caring with that, and to Luke's point, when you can go and watch Bridgerton. Instead, William, in your cupboard, you've sat there with your little yellow hand up all this time, William. I'm so sorry, it's 6 minutes to go and I've kept you waiting. Hiya.
Hello to all assembled Tortoise.
Hello to you. Are you all right? You need a window. The sun's out now, William. You don't need to hide away.
I close the window, yes, but I'm staring out of the window as well as at you.
As our lovely faces. Well, what do you make of all this, William?
Hugely impressed by what Emily Benn says, and very much a part of her whole background as a hugely articulate and impassioned defender of our parliamentary right. That might have something to do with family background, perhaps, with stuff.
She's all her own work, Emily Benn. I can absolutely attest to that.
Can I offer, talking about family background, can I offer a positive anecdote?
Please do.
In search of a story, as it were. My South Wales-based 84 going on 85-year-old dad, pre-COVID, had heart issues, he had bladder issues, he had prostate stuff, all of which has been brilliantly handled, partly because he's got a very positive frame of mind. But yesterday he went to have his bladder checkup at the local hospital. First of all, he was very impressed that it was an all-girl team. He's 84.5. These medical professionals are in their 30s, and he thought that was a wonderful story. Also, they are coping, it seems, very well on an individual hospital by hospital, institution by institution basis with the non-COVID stuff, if we can call it thus. And I wonder whether there's a bit of, if we have to do a bit of non-Boris boosterism, but boosterism nonetheless with
with one another,
hijacking some of his phrases for a different kind of boosterism, in terms of if you like, upping the positivity of actually what's going on, or what can go on between patient and medical staff in this extraordinary times, but also this extraordinary story of the fact that we've got a health service at all, which still functions 70 years on. And now we've got 3 generations plus of doctors and nurses and ancillary staff, as well as patients, who have kept that extraordinary vigor of what it's about. Now, I know that's big and it's Panglossian and it's as I am, I suppose. But I just wondered whether there was anything in that, and I put it to Tortoise Collective.
Wonder whether there's anything in the ability of the health service to just keep on keeping on, is what you mean?
Yeah, and the positivity around that. Because we hear a lot of what's going wrong, but there is stuff going right as well, as there always is. But I just wonder whether it's a sort of subtlety here of being, because we all have our concerns and worries which manifest themselves in various ways. But I just wondered whether there was something around this keeping on, as you say, but also knowing that because of the extraordinary story of the vaccines, that we've got something right as well.
For sure.
In the midst of all the talking stuff, our generation is brilliant at talking, and we've had to learn to act.
Thank you, William, and I really agree, actually, in so far as for all of the really awful, grand scale mixture of tragedies and cock-ups, frankly, and all of the awfulness, I think there have been a sort of real tapestry of small scale triumphs and brilliance and volunteers and all of that, and just to sort of round us out in the last minute, my very good friend who's been featured, funnily enough, in some of the Tortoise photo essays that we've published from inside the COVID ward. She happens to work there. Her job title is Matron of COVID, and she is obviously an extraordinary person. I went and dropped off some bits and bobs at the bottom of her little path outside her house. She's got young kids and mine are too big for them, so she's sort of in the downstream of the toys that we're too big for, and hers are just growing into. A couple of nights ago, and she came to the door far away, and she said, just the last 3 days, just the last 3 days, it is better inside the ICU department of the big London hospital where she works. And I think that sort of the look in her eyes is something of somebody who has been through something really quite extraordinary, but she sort of, I could sort of visibly see she was almost taller with the sort of relief of when she went in. It's tough still, but not absolutely desperate. So to Jennifer Allison's point, mindset, character, expertise, professionalism, and just dogged determination, and there's a lot we can take from that. Thanks so much. It's been a really fascinating hour, very lively chat, brilliant contributions. Thank you to everybody who's come and spoken, obviously to William very much, to Emily and Luke, to James for marshalling the chat, to Phoebe right at the beginning, Louise Jarvis, to Tanish, everybody. It's been really, really fascinating. Please do try and get outside and enjoy the sunshine wherever you are today, even if just for 20 minutes. Go and have a cup of tea outside. It's just one of the pleasures of springtime, and smell the air. It's lovely. We'll see you all very soon. I think our next thinking, there's no thinking tomorrow, but it's the future of money on Thursday. So we will see you for that. All the best. Take care.